So I'm sitting back there, and the children's moment comes along, and Geneva tells a great story. And it sounds pretty familiar to me. And I look down, and by George, it's what I was going to read for the scripture lesson. And I had everything all lined out. I had a great introduction, and she took it away from me. So, I'm not going to give you a feeling of deja vu all over again and reread Paul's letter to the church of Corinth. But I am going to talk a little bit about being a member of this church and being a member of a group of people pulling in one direction. Now, this is not going to make very much sense right here, right now, in this arena. But there's a gentleman named P.J. Fleck, who is the head football coach at the University of Minnesota. Bra Rasta Yuma. And he has a saying that is very simple. 3 words. Row the boat. And the story behind that is that when one person rows the boat, you get somewhere, but you don't get there very fast. And if there's ever trouble with choppy seas or something like that, you get, it becomes even more difficult. But if 2 people get together and row the boat, then it becomes a little bit easier. If 3 or 4 or more get together, even easier. And the other, so Mr. Fleck's doctrine, which he has designed primarily for success on the gridiron, might even be used in this church, that together we can work together and show Christian love to each other and row the boat. Thus endeth the reading of our scripture. Yeah, gospel according to Truex. So what we're doing today is having members of the church talk about being called to serve. And the scripture was part and parcel of that. So I'm going to call on, and I don't know how I ended up being the MC here, but maybe we can ask, I believe Matt, you're leading off, or is Dick? Dick Bauer is leading off, followed by Matt, and then Sue Armentrout and Myra Beeler will bat cleanup. Then we will have a brief report on our the conference's annual meeting in Pendleton.
Morning. I'm Dick Bauer, and for the last 4 years I've been assistant treasurer of the church, and I've been working with Ralph Basie, who we think has been treasurer of the church for 20 years, but nobody's quite sure. We're working together. We kind of pass the baton from one to the other as our schedules permit, and for me, it's been a real learning experience, and working with Ralph has been really educational for me. A couple of weeks ago, Terry Wyberty asked me to respond to a question regarding stewardship. And the question was, what made you answer God's call to serve the church? So I thought about that for quite a bit, stewed on it, and come up with 3 reasons, which I'd like to elaborate on this morning. The first one, I guess, is pretty obvious, or should have been, and that's the example set by my parents. As a kid, I was into baseball. We lived in the Chicago area, and the Chicago teams were kind of hot and cold, mostly cold in terms of the Cubs. So one of my heroes was Yogi Berra, New York Yankees. He was a catcher, star player, really solid family man, according to what I've been able to read about him. And later in his career, he became a manager of the baseball teams and also a coach. So he had a very, I think, fulfilling career. But he's probably just as well known for his yogiisms, these kind of circular comments that he made, and for what he did for the English language, or maybe to the English language. But one of my favorite yogiisms was, you can observe a lot by watching. And I think that's really what I did, because my parents were involved in church, and as the oldest child, I was there to watch. My mother was a Sunday school teacher, longtime choir member, which meant that she had a lot of practices for choir, and then often the rest of us would go to special service that she was going to be singing at. My father was a church treasurer, so there might be a genetic component of me getting involved in this role. He also was a man, he was a real doer, but he wasn't an open philosopher. And so when he made a comment to me at some stage that when I grew up, I could get a job and then I could help support the church, that kind of stuck with me. Our family attended the First Congregational Church in Western Springs, Illinois. It's a suburb of Chicago. It's about 15 miles west of downtown. It's on the Burlington Railroad, where many of the people in town commute for jobs. There are very few jobs in manufacturing or jobs of any kind in the town. It's a classic bedroom community. The church was very active, very prominent in town, and BJ and I had a chance to go back, well, it's probably been 8 or 10 years ago now, and saw that it was still a very vibrant place. As the oldest child, both BJ and I were the oldest children in our family. We were the ones that I think our parents placed most hope on, and expectations, maybe a little more pressure might be more accurate. And BJ and I refer to that role as kind of the first pancake syndrome. You know, you do your best with the first pancake, and you're not going to throw it away, but maybe you're going to do things a little different later on. So the second reason that I got involved in church activities was, I think, triggered by becoming a parent myself. We have 2 sons. They're now in their mid-40s. And as we moved around the country, there were a lot of opportunities for young families to get involved or go in different directions. Certainly sports provided, a lot of options for our boys. And yet nobody ever accused anybody in my family or BJ's family of being athletic. And so this wasn't quite the right fit, although we did go down that route a little bit. We saw baseball. Our oldest son was in baseball and watching butterflies mostly in the outfield. And then there was the soccer where he scored a goal for the other team because midway through the game, they changed the goal position. And he didn't pick up on it. So that was kind of our experience with sports. The schedules were tough. And at that point that we really got into it, I was commuting a 100-mile round trip for a new job. And therefore it got into our supper time. And that was very dangerous because you don't want to get between me and my food bowl. And so eventually we decided that having supper as a family was a value. So we dropped sports and we decided, PJ and I, that church, Boy Scouts, and music were going to be our family values. And so we spent time towards those activities, and we were usually the leaders or involved in them heavily. And that gave us a lot of insights about how those programs were being conducted, and we had some influence over that. It also gave us some insights as to how our sons were doing, how were they behaving, and we could make corrective actions if we needed to. But I think the bigger thing that it did was it provided those activities with a sense of importance, or the fact that they were family values. And we found that that was a really good way to be a parent. As for our specific involvements, we've been involved in Sunday school teachers, church committee members, chairperson of committees, and church council members over our time. So we felt that involvement in church was a real value to us. The third reason I think that I chose to get involved in church activities was the fact that it was a way to connect with other people in a new community, because that was kind of our fate. We've been married 53 years, and we've lived in, Virginia, Illinois, 4 places in Oregon, Connecticut, and Wisconsin. So connecting with a new community was always pretty important. The reason for these moves was varied, but often military service, employee transfers, job changes. That pretty much summed it up, I guess. And although there are many different ways that you could connect with people in a new community, it just seems like church for us was the right way. And we found that joining UCC Church, based on our backgrounds, was the best choice for us. It aligned with our values and our view of life. We weren't told what to think, but we were told to think, which I think is particularly important in these times. So I've given what I think are 3 reasons that I decided to contribute and get involved in church. But why serve in a role involving church finances and business? That's a question I've asked myself sometimes. I guess we each have different backgrounds and skills, so why not serve in a way that uses them best? And I think the children's sermon this morning pretty much shows why that might be a good approach. I worked in and around the forest products industry. It's always in technical jobs and only in administrative jobs very late in my career. And it was a roller coaster ride, because that industry, as many are now, follows the economy, and in particular housing starts. So we found ourselves moving quite a bit. New opportunities, or at least some opportunity. As a technical person, I feel like most of my colleagues who are technical were often removed from the business realities of the business. But very early in my career, I realized that you probably ought to be interested in the business aspects if you were interested in having a job. And so I kind of changed my, I guess, inherent approach as a technical person to be only interested in how to develop a new widget or make widgets. You had to kind of go beyond that and say, well, is anybody going to buy a widget? So I think there's a parallel here with the church and stewardship, this season of stewardship. No, the church is not a business. We're a nonprofit. But we have certain obligations in common with a business. We have staff salaries and benefits. We have utilities to pay. We have building maintenance, office supplies, insurance, and many other things that we pay for. So we have those obligations to deal with, and in my role as assistant treasurer, I've certainly been involved in those. Our church has a 179-year history. Depending on how you do the math, that could be 8 or 9 generations. People have brought us to this point. They've been very generous. We're in a very good situation on a lot of fronts. Those folks have built and maintained our church, and it's now our challenge to go another 7 generations is the target for our current stewardship campaign. I think we all got a letter probably last week regarding that. And through our collective efforts, we can continue serving this special place of community for generations to come. Well, I'd ask you to please review your individual finances and respond to the 2025 stewardship campaign by completing the pledge card. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. It's difficult to follow this. Dick said a number of wonderful things and a number of wonderful good reasons to volunteer. Listening to the messages today, and the combination of the children's moment and even our prayer time, I feel a bit of divine intervention in terms of a set of messages coming together. That as I thought about why I volunteer, I think the first is to think about we all have only a certain amount of time and money and whatever else of our resources we could give, and so we do have to prioritize a bit. But if I look at decided some time ago after coming, this church needs to exist, right? It needs to actually continue to exist. And this isn't, as I thought about this more, this isn't just Christian churches in Forest Grove need to exist. I mean, I think if we looked around any given Sunday, there were plenty of open spots and pews at all kinds of churches that we have around Forest Grove. But I've been to different churches, and I think that many of us have, and so I was trying to find my way here with my family some number of years ago, and many of them kind of gave the feeling that the group comes together sort of in the church, and as the doors finally close, everyone can kind of breathe a sigh of relief that finally those of us that really are doing it right can sort of be here together, and we can be away from all of those people, all of those other people out there that are doing it wrong. So I can spend a couple hours together and be reminded that yes, we're all doing the right thing, and have a nice sermon about how horrible things are out there. There's other people trying to get us, and all feel good about that. And I can come out of the church and be, energized about that. But obviously, I think that kind of attitude leads to kind of what we end up reading and hearing and seeing about perceptions that people have of the Christian church sort of in general. That can't help but bleed out when you leave to say, look at anything unfamiliar as bad, right? I don't understand what that is, so that's bad. That's not the thing that I usually see when I come together. But if you look at our messages, and I think I could sum it up any better than Jimmy this morning, right? To say that the fact that you're welcome here in this church, right? None of us actually pretends to know any better than anybody else how it is that you're supposed to live, but we welcome anyone to come here together to be part of the discussion, and part of learning together, what it is that we think that Jesus in the Bible teaches us, and the 7 generations as well, and just like where Dick left off. Even if it's not 7 generations, right? There's some responsibility, or maybe not even responsibility, opportunity to make sure that we're here when people discover that they need it, right? I mean, maybe there's somebody out there right now that's looked to find us or a church, but maybe they will, next week, or maybe they will, next month, and it would be, wrong if they didn't have a welcoming place to come and actually learn about God and be with a sense of wonderful people. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Pareto principle, but it's originally an economic principle that was developed by Vilfredo Pareto, and he was in Italy, and at the time he realized that it was novel at the time, but he realized that in Italy at the time, in 1904, I believe it was, that 80% of the wealth in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. So I mean, that was kind of interesting. Now we have a lot of wealth distribution discussions in the U.S., but it was interesting that he was one of those first to make that observation in Italy and in economics. But as people looked at that over the years, they find that this 20-80 principle applies in lots of different ways. In general, it's been generalized to say, in many places, 80% of the outcomes are, come from 20% of the causes, for any given environment. So how that could be applied in a work context, for example, is you could say, maybe actually 20% of the tasks, 20% of the time you actually spend at work is probably responsible for 80% of your actual measurable output. And I think if you sort of think about that, I think that that's probably true, or sort of anything you do. But I actually first learned about this principle from my mom. She was a single mother growing up, had just me and my brother going through things. But how she explained the Pareto principle to me was related to organizations and volunteer organizations in particular, where I think the wisdom is, if you look at any organization, and you can see as you look around, it doesn't matter what the organization is, it kind of feels like 20% of the people do 80% of the work. and it just is, right? It's just something that happens. It's not, positive or negative. It just seems to be how things just sort of evolve, if you look at kind of any organization there. But as we grew up, it was a big part of, both my mom showing through doing, and much like, Dick and his family were describing as well, that she was clear that, she always wanted to try as hard as she could to be part of that 20%. So, so growing up, even though she was a single mother, right, she was a Cub Scout leader, she was part of our, band booster club, the board of directors for Little League, the Boy Scout committee, kind of any place that needed to be, part of the organization to make it go. And so I've tried as well, sort of my motivation to sort of look that forward, to say if there are organizations that I'm part of that are important enough, then I'll do what I can to be, part of that 20% as well. Like Dick, if I think of how I ended up in finance and property, a bit the same. I was invited by Jerry and Carl Heiser to join us, I don't even know how many years ago, some number of years ago, to join finance and property, because they had been, a key part of the big 20% of the church for many of its years. And also, again, a bit like Dick mentioned, just kind of based on my history in my professional job, I'm in computer science, but a lot of numbers sort of going on in this space. This whole notion of whether it's a computer program or a set of numbers, I like the sort of comfort zone there to say, once you find a set of numbers that go together in some sort of a equation or program, it just is, right? It might take a long time to figure it out how to make a certain set of numbers total something, but once you've done that, that's the answer, right? So you can take that, you can send it around, and nobody has to look and interpret it and say, ooh, I don't like that answer because it came from, Mac or somebody I don't believe with. So I think, there's one answer, 2 plus 2 always equals 4, right? Sort of, that's it. And so, that part of the budget, and things related to finance and property have always agreed with me. But just like Geneva was talking about this morning, that does, I'll just admit, things aren't as comfortable for me, sort of, again, recruiting more volunteers, trying to get more fundraisers going, and even though I know those kinds of things are important, not generally something that's easy for me necessarily to go do that. And so it's kind of like Dick was saying, that this is an important organization, needs to keep going. And so, I encourage all of you to think about kind of how you're spending your time. Because one last thing I wanted to say is, if I look at my own time, right, we're all busy, but I guess if I look at where I could carve out some time to do this, if it wasn't always between 10 and 11 on Sunday, there's time I can carve out. If I can subtract from some of the doom scrolling, I think, that all of us do, right? Say, if I look at, how much time I'm doing reading garbage on the internet, it just makes me angry, right? So, okay, well, I could actually take a few hours off from that and actually, maybe spend it on something more productive and with people that I enjoy. So, again, I just encourage, all of you to think about all the many needs of our church that, as Dick mentioned on the needs, right, it took me a little bit too, as I wasn't heavily involved in church growing up, to really understand, what it means to be a congregational church, right? So that actually means, a big part of it is that we don't have some giant national body or some, hidden group of billionaires across the country that'll just send us some money for staff, or, a giant international endowment that just, pays us when we get into trouble. I mean, that actually doesn't exist, right? I mean, it's just us, right, that are kind of, making the church continue to go. So, Again, with that in mind, I encourage each of you to sort of think about if there are any ways that speak to you to help.
It occurred to me that I could probably answer the question about why do I volunteer and get involved in the church with a single sentence. Because it's what you do. But no, I'm not going to stop exercises. My choir is kibitzing at me. But I'm only halfway being facetious about that because that's how I grew up. Sounds like not unlike Dick's experience. My family's habit was not only that we went to church every Sunday, but that we were involved and committed and we participated and contributed. And that's just always felt really important to me and always been a big piece of what made my relationship with the church meaningful. So I was thinking about why is that? Firstly, as has been addressed both by Dick and Matt, it just stands to reason that if any sort of organization is important to you, you have a certain responsibility to do what you can to help ensure its success. But way more than that for me, being involved enriches my experience greatly. It fosters a sense of belonging and a feeling of ownership, and just overall makes the experience much more meaningful in many different ways. And as Matt was saying, and I actually, and Dick also, one of the things you can do with service to the church is find your spot, find something that aligns with your talents and your interests. For me, being involved in worship planning and in our music program and in beautifying our sanctuary allows me to engage in activities that I already really like doing, and gives me an outlet for the gifts that God has given me, and all the while doing that in service to our church. And I was thinking, when you think about all the different moving parts that are involved in the operation of the church, there's numbers to be crunched, and children to be looked after, and music to be made, and dinners to be cooked, and leaves to be raked, and pub crawls to be organized. I think any of us would be hard-pressed not to find a spot that aligned with our talents and our skills and our interests and the things that we loved doing. The other thing that involvement brings is an opportunity to increase connection, because I get to spend time with people that I already know and love, and it also gives me an opportunity to get better acquainted with people that I don't know. Something has been kind of rummaging around in my brain all week after last week when Rod talked to the young people about giving and talked about those 3 T's of giving that we all know about: time, talent, and trust, and how Nate, the self-described mouth of the body, I don't think any of us were surprised at that, how he was very adamant that there was a T missing there, and that was trust. And it seemed to me that fit into this equation somehow. And I was thinking 2 things, and then Terry's prayer that she had with us this morning right before the service added another dimension to it to me. When I would say yes to some sort of leadership opportunity or volunteer opportunity in the church, all of you are trusting that I'm going to take care of whatever that task is. And conversely, I have to trust that you're all not just going to throw me in the deep end and leave me to, try to find my way to the surface, but that there will be support and encouragement and assistance when needed. And the other part of that I suppose should be obvious, is that I also have to trust that if I say yes to that I will have the ability, and God will help me to do whatever that thing is. So when all sides of that trust are in play, it's one of the things that can help to make service within the church a really rewarding and joyful and fulfilling experience. And so I would encourage you to take part in that, not only because the church needs all of us, but also for what you will receive in return. And so many of you that I look at are already doing that and already know that. So thank you.
If I'm going to preach from the pulpit. When I was asked to participate in this morning's service, my first thought was, why me? But after considering the idea, it occurred to me there might be a good idea to share my perspective with regard to serving this community. And it's going to sound kind of like other people's, but I'll go ahead anyway. I'm not a terribly introspective or analytical person, so I can't say that through self-examination I've had a message from God or Jesus, for that matter. I think my upbringing caused me to develop an ingrained sense of responsibility. As long as I can remember, church has been a part of my life. My first experiences with church were in the Yakima, Washington First Congregational Church, where the minister, Dr. Robinson, would deliver a children's story, and then we would be dismissed to our Sunday school classes. When I had just started first grade, our family moved to Forest Grove, and we immediately became a part of the Congregational Church family. I made lifelong friends. Lauren Waltz, who is no longer in this congregation because they moved to Lake Oswego, Jane Romig, Peggy, I always want to call her Peggy Scarston, Peggy Alexander. We've known each other since I was 6, which is a long time ago. We also were in children's choir, which started my musical connection with the church. As we grew older, the youth groups here, we had Lincongo, named after Lincoln Junior High congregational goers. During junior high and then Pilgrim Fellowship in high school, it gave me opportunities to socialize with my friends and people who are my own age. In fact, in my particular instance, church activities provided most of my social life. I married my husband Richard in this church, and when he passed away in 2008, his memorial service was held here. As far as service is concerned, my parents taught by example. Dad was in the choir, and he also served, I think they called them elders in those days, but it could have been something else. I don't remember that detail. Mom was active in the women's fellowship circles and was also the chairperson of the first annual fundraising barbecue here. That first year, which was back in the 40s or early 50s, was called the Boiler Barbecue, and we didn't know it was going to continue year after year. But the funds raised were used to buy a new boiler for the steam heat furnace that was our heat source in the old building. She was also an instrumental part of the group that put together the Family Favorites Cookbook that I still have. She never sought praise or recognition for the services she performed for this church. I think I picked up on the idea that volunteering is something you just do, if it fits within the realm of your capabilities. Personally, I think the crew that comes here to provide food for the hungry every week deserves more recognition than I do. The Sunday school teachers and the youth advisors are also worthy of praise, as well as the ushers who serve faithfully week after week. But in my case, When an opportunity to serve comes along, I think about what kind of time commitment it will require, and whether I have the necessary skills to do the job. Over the years, I've served on the executive board, both as a member and as the moderator. Been on finance and property for a number of years. Worship commission many years ago. I've painted several rooms here in the church, including the office. And I have chaired 3 capital fund drives, as well as being a contact person for Family Promise. Now, I'm not saying this to bring praise upon myself or anything, but this, when you think about it and what your time commitment is, something will be, if you can do it, maybe you should. We used to have in our annual fund, a thing where we talked about giving of your time, your talent, and your treasure. And I think it would be wise for us to think in those terms. What can I give in terms of time? What talents do I have to lend to this organization? And of course, there's always the financial part, which was covered pretty thoroughly. When I think about it, this church is my spiritual home. And who doesn't take care of their home? To the best of their ability. Sometimes when the job doesn't fit your skill set, you find someone else to do it. In this congregation, we have people with all kinds of skills and interests. And when everyone contributes as they can, the whole church benefits.
Amen.
And now, I have an announcement to make. I have come to a point where I can no longer be your Family Promise representative. The job's important, but not terribly time consuming. As the Hillsborough House opens soon, it'll be more convenient to provide assistance to their programs and get more people within the congregation involved as we were pre-COVID. I will be 85 years old in December, and I'm resigning my position as of January 1st. And I hope there'll be somebody out there who will be willing to jump in the pool and take over this wonderful job that I've been in for years. Thank you.
Beginning of a report from the Central Pacific Conference's fall gathering. 7 of us came from Forest Grove to Pendleton last weekend in September. Excuse me. I knew I would be in good company because I had hitched a ride and a room with Susan Shepherd and Mary Mullen. I knew I would be in good company because whenever I've participated in conference events, I've met good people. Friday, however, was a downer for me. I felt disoriented. We were asked to bring a quart of soil, and when there were 8 of us around a table, we were supposed to all put our quart of soil in a 1-quart bowl on the dining room table, and I didn't think that was going to work out. I was doing the math. I also felt isolated. I felt like my story, where I came from, was not in the script and not accepted. And I felt like I was being asked to sign into a blame and shame game, which I don't do real well. So I started scribbling in my notebook, and I scribbled, doodled, and then I scribbled, "Shut up, Sandra." I closed the book and I shut down. It's not the kind of report you'd expect to hear from me. Unfortunately, the next day was Saturday and a brand new day. They had buses waiting to take us an hour north of Pendleton to past Walla Walla, Washington, to the site of the Whitman Mission. It is now an historical site operated by National Park Rangers, with a wonderful video that told the story in 20 minutes from a different perspective than we've probably heard before. We had park rangers giving us small guided tours, allergies. And the tour that I was in, the park ranger ended it by saying, I hope you take something home by this experience. She said, for me, it is that the small decisions we make might have large consequences. And I thought about that all the way back to the Wild Horse Casino where our convention is being held. In the afternoon, they have little shuttles whisk us way around the corner to a museum of and by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Cayuse. The name of the building is, the museum is Tamasklist, and that means messenger. There, they told their story from their perspective. And again, they had guides waiting to take us in small groups. I chose to just meander as my heart led. And so I stepped outside, and there was an archaeologist whittling away on obsidian while he talked, forming it into an arrowhead. And obsidian is actually sharper than surgical tools, made of steel. I went to a room filled with 300 years of native beadwork, and I could see the progression, how they incorporated things through the years and how it changed their artwork. It was beautiful. I went into a room that was like a cave, and there you had the experience of seeing and listening to the story on the ceiling of Coyote. And then went through a series of presentations that showed the history from about a 400-year history of the native peoples and how their lives changed from people who moved to where the seasonal resources were to people who had the Hudson Bay Company and mountaineers and fur traders come in. So they, and before that, I should say, thank you, Miss Allergy. Cedar Deodora is doing its thing today. An example is the Cayuse. They thought they were pretty hot stuff, and so they liked to, upon occasion, go to neighboring areas and have little skirmishes. And probably in the early 18th century, so early 1700s, they did that, and here was a whole bunch of people, and they were sitting on horses. And they went, horses? Wow, they didn't have horses then, but they acquired horses. The horses were introduced through the Americas, through the Spanish. And the Cayuse became noted for their horsemanship and developed even a Cayuse pony. That was really neat to know. The beadwork, that came from Hudson Bay Company, and there were several other trading companies in the area. So we had trade coming from China, and the locals learned that they could sell their beaver hides and other articles in exchange for copper, for cloth, and beads from China. So you got to see the progression. And it kind of went downhill for them from there because there were missionaries, and then there were a lot of people, westward ho, and then there was measles, and there was smallpox, and you must stay on the reservation. And I can't imagine how their lives changed in about 100 years. Fortunately, at the end, they showed some of the people from today, and it ended up with kids playing baseball. Happy kids playing baseball. It was wonderful. So Saturday was a good day. Sunday was icing on the cake. Our conference pastor, Tyler, said during worship this statement. He said, "This is not a matter of blame and shame. And I went, thank you. And then our keynote speaker had been unable to come just at the last minute. So on the fly, they asked this pastor from FGUCC to fill in. And I have to tell you, Brendan was fantastic. He brought it all together. He led us in a 5-stage meditation. He was personable. He was inviting. And you could see everybody in the room spread out, find their comfort zone, and be into phase 1. Ding! We got up and stretched. Phase 2. And at the end of it, I felt like it had all come together for me too. I felt such gratitude for this land that I was born into. And I'm not sure if I was more proud of the fact that Brendan just happened to come from our church, or more pleased that here was a man with a special gift that he was willing to and could share with our conference. So it was a good weekend, and Susan Shepherd could drive fast.
You have a bibliography that Dina so graciously assembled for us. It's located throughout the church. These are books that deal with popping the bubble of the myth of the American West and allowing for introspection. And in some cases it does play. Some of these books have sections that do play the blame game, but we can get beyond that. One of them is particularly meaningful, and it is The Murder Mission by Blaine Harden. And it talks about the murders at the mission in Walla Walla. There are a couple of sections that I would like to read, and then I'm going to leave it. That will be my contribution. This is from the foreword written by Mr. Harden. Whitman's story was a real-life Old West passion play, or so it seemed. Violent death at the hands of tomahawk-slinging hostiles gave the story a stirring shiver of last-stand martyrdom. It linked Whitman to General George Armstrong Custer at Little Bighorn, to Davy Crockett at the Alamo, even to Christ at Calvary. What no one told me at the time, and this is the author speaking, was that the Whitman story was largely a pack of lies. And that's what we had to deal with on that trip to the mission that Saturday. The U.S. Park Service has done a great deal in working and rewriting their narrative to fit what has gone on. Later on in the introduction, he closes it off with, the Whitman saved Oregon story was a similarly surreal Western confabulation. Anybody that uses the word confabulation is okay in my book. 2 decades after running for his life from the Cayuse who killed the Whitmans, the middle-aged Henry Spalding massaged his fading frontier memories, spiced them with hysterical resentments, and colluded with other Protestant ministers to fabricate an utterly original American icon. Pious, fearless, and handy with a horse, he was Marcus Whitman, the martyred missionary doctor who galloped across America, sweet-talked the President of the United States, and added 3 stars to the red, white, and blue. Warren G. Harding, a forgettable American president, but a wily American demagogue, explained it best after delivering a speech in 1923 that celebrated the Whitman lie and all its horse-riding, flag-waving, God-fearing glory. Harding observed, well, if it isn't true, it ought to be. This book tracks the long and unlikely arc spark of the great American lie. An unemployed and embittered Presbyterian minister created it as catnip for church countrymen who like their politics and their history to be simple, action-packed, hero-driven, patriotic, self-congratulatory, and ordained by Almighty God. Spalding's fraud helped him get a job. It sanctified and encouraged conquest of the West. It transformed a mediocre missionary doctor into a martyred American hero, and it all but exterminated an Indian tribe. Spalding's story is so thrilling an adjective invariably used in handbills promoting church lectures about Whitman's ride that even after it was shown to be a deliberate falsehood and self-contradicting nonsense, many white Americans, specifically, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, refused to let it go. They couldn't help but retell the story in Sunday sermons, outdoor summer spectacles, and public school plays. The Whitman lie is a timeless reminder that in America, a good story has an insidious way of trumping a true one, especially if that story confirms our virtue, congratulates our pluck, and enshrines our status as God's chosen people. So it was very meaningful to me to take that school bus ride, which seemed to last for 16 hours, those of us who've ridden in school buses, and to walk on the ground that many heroes walked on, and it wasn't the Whitmans that were the heroes. It was those of us that are searching deep into our souls and looking forever for the truth. We may not find it, but the journey is what makes it worthwhile. I had other prepared notes, and I'm going to step aside for Susan.
As you can see, the fall gathering of the Central Pacific Conference can be very exciting, can be challenging, can be full of connection. Many of you already know that I have worshipped and been a member of 4 UCC churches in this conference. I was christened in the Ashland Church, and then my parents became missionaries, and we lived overseas most of my childhood. And then I have been a member of the Lake Oswego United Church of Christ. I've been a member at Bridgeport United Church of Christ, and Michael and I are beyond excited and pleased and content to be members of the Forest Grove United Church of Christ. And as Dick was saying, when you go to a new town, it had a university and it had a church. And that's why we're here. And we just belong. It's my first time really to have a hometown in my life. And I'm 73 to go back. I would really like for you to consider being a delegate to our annual gathering and to our conference. For me, the tight-knit and yet open, how can we be tight-knit and yet have all these pores for be welcoming? Part of this church, we are siblings, but we have a big family that we all belong to within the conference and within the national church. And we're fiercely independent congregation by congregation because we make all of our decisions together. But we give guidelines. For instance, the national church is working very hard for us to become an anti-racist church. And so each individual church is working on this project on their own and in their conferences. So that's one reason that this particular weekend was devoted to better understanding of the relationship between Native peoples and the erroneously, perhaps well-intentioned missionaries who came out with no knowledge of language, no knowledge of culture, misguided. And it was particularly meaningful for me this particular weekend because 38 years ago, my mother researched for 2 years, from 1984 to 86, and printed through our conference a book about the history of the mission and resources for churches to use to study. And I looked back at it, I found it on my shelf because I have my family treasures. And the purpose of that study 38 years ago was to illuminate our contemporary approach to missions with a reassessment of the status of Native peoples and their church's relationship. I really missed my mother that weekend. I would have liked very much to talk to her about her research and also this greater understanding and insight has proceeded in the 38 years. Where would she be now? Where am I now? What is our responsibility? Anyway, I think one way to serve the church is to spend time talking to each other about very important issues. Thank you.